Welcome back, everybody. Today we're doing a deep dive into the world of hydrogen energy.
Oh, yeah.
Um, this is a topic that seems like it's constantly in the news these days.
It is.
And, for good reason, I think. I think it have a lot of people excited about
Yeah.
the possibilities. So we've got a ton of research papers and reports that we've been digging into.
Okay.
And, so we're going to kind of break down all the latest advancements and some of the stuff that we found that was particularly interesting in there.
Sounds good.
So to kind of kick things off, maybe you could give us a little bit of a breakdown
Sure.
of what hydrogen energy is and why it's, why everybody's so excited about it, especially when we're talking about sustainability and climate change and things like that.
Yeah, sure. So, at a very basic level, hydrogen is an energy carrier. So it doesn't actually contain energy itself, but it can store energy from other sources. So think of it like a battery.
Okay.
You can use it to store energy from solar panels or wind turbines, and then release that energy later when you need it. And the best part is when you use hydrogen as a fuel source, the only byproduct is water.
Wow. That's
No harmful emissions.
really, really amazing.
No carbon footprint, just clean energy.
I mean, that's kind of like the holy grail of energy, right?
Pretty much, yeah. That's why there's so much buzz around it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard this term thrown around, green hydrogen.
Yes.
And I've also heard, I think I heard you say something about gray hydrogen.
Right.
So are there different types of hydrogen? What's the difference?
Yeah, you're right. Not all hydrogen is created equal.
Okay.
The color of hydrogen basically refers to how it's produced.
Oh.
So gray hydrogen, which is the most common type right now,
Yeah.
is made from natural gas.
Good on.
And so it still has a carbon footprint associated with it.
Okay.
Green hydrogen, on the other hand, is made using renewable energy sources like solar and wind power.
Uh-huh.
And they use that to split water molecules. And that makes it the cleanest option.
Okay, so green hydrogen is kind of the one we should be aiming for.
Yeah, that's the one that holds the most promise for a truly sustainable future.
Gotcha. So it sounds like 2024 was a pretty big year for hydrogen,
It was.
especially in China. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about what happened and why it seems like the whole world is kind of watching what's happening there?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2024, China officially recognized hydrogen as an energy source in its energy law.
Mhm.
So it was a landmark decision. It kind of signaled that China's really committed to developing hydrogen as a key part of its energy strategy.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, I mean, China's really been making a big push towards clean energy, right?
Exactly. And when China makes a move like that, the whole world takes notice.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's such a major player on the global stage.
Absolutely.
So, one of the things that I thought was really interesting when we were reading through all these reports was the fact that the cost of electrolyzers
Yes,
seems to be coming down.
it is.
And that's a good thing, right?
Oh, yeah, it's a huge deal.
Can you explain, what an electrolyzer is and why the cost coming down is so important?
Yeah, so electrolyzers are basically the machines that use electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen,
Uh-huh.
and they're essential for producing green hydrogen.
Okay.
So the cost of these machines has really plummeted in the last few years, like almost 50%,
Wow. That's,
which is crazy. Yeah, and it's mainly due to advances in materials and manufacturing processes.
gotcha.
And this is a game changer because it means green hydrogen is becoming more and more competitive with fossil fuels,
Right.
which makes it much more viable for widespread adoption.
So it's not just like a pie in the sky idea anymore. It's actually,
It's becoming more realistic.
yeah, a real contender in the energy market.
That's really interesting. And one other thing that really kind of blew my mind was this research coming out of China
Yeah.
about producing green hydrogen from seawater.
Yeah. Pretty amazing.
What are the implications of that? Because it seems like if you can get hydrogen from seawater.
It's kind of a game changer, right?
Exactly. So traditional electrolysis requires very pure water,
Okay.
which can be expensive to obtain, but being able to use seawater just opens up this vast resource.
Yeah.
It's like an almost limitless resource for green hydrogen production.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Imagine harnessing the power of the ocean to create clean energy.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
Yeah, it has the potential to completely revolutionize the way we think about energy production.
Yeah, for sure. And so, I mean, okay, so you can produce this green hydrogen,
Right.
but you have to store it. You have to move it around. You have to get it to where it needs to go.
Exactly.
So what are some of the challenges around storing and transporting hydrogen?
Yeah. So hydrogen is a tricky molecule to work with.
Okay.
It's very light. and it wants to escape, so it can be difficult to store and transport.
Gotcha.
Traditional methods involve either compressing it under high pressure
Uh-huh.
or cooling it down to a liquid state, both of which can be energy intensive and expensive.
Yeah, for sure.
But the good news is that researchers are coming up with some really creative solutions.
Okay, so like give us some examples of what they're doing.
Okay, so for one, there's this exciting research in Japan on a new nanomaterial
Okay.
that can absorb and release hydrogen at room temperature and pressure.
Wow.
So you can think of it like a sponge that soaks up hydrogen,
Mhm.
which makes it much safer and easier to store and transport than in these big, bulky, high-pressure tanks.
Okay, so no more like giant explosive hydrogen tanks. That's a good thing.
Exactly.
So are there any other ways that they're looking at making it easier to move this stuff around?
Yeah, so another interesting approach is being developed in Australia, where researchers are looking at using ammonia as a carrier for hydrogen. So ammonia is much easier to store and transport than pure hydrogen.
Okay.
And we already have an extensive infrastructure for handling it. So the idea is to ship this ammonia around the world and then extract the hydrogen at the destination.
Okay, so that's smart because you're just using the infrastructure we already have.
Yeah. Exactly,
So
yeah.
you don't have to build all this new stuff.
Right.
So, I mean, we keep talking about production, we keep talking about transportation, but I'm kind of curious.
Yeah.
Like, what are we actually going to use all this hydrogen for? Like, are we just talking about hydrogen cars, or are there other applications that people are excited about?
Yeah, so hydrogen cars are definitely part of the picture,
Okay.
but the applications go way beyond that.
Okay.
One of the most exciting areas is using hydrogen in industries that are traditionally heavy emitters of greenhouse gases.
Oh, okay. So tell me more about that. Like, how is hydrogen going to help decarbonize those industries?
Right, so take steel production, for example.
Okay.
It's a process that currently relies heavily on coal, and it's a major contributor to carbon emissions.
Gotcha.
But now, companies are starting to use green hydrogen to replace coal in the steelmaking process,
Wow.
which significantly reduces their carbon footprint.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a huge step forward in making these essential industries more sustainable.
So, we've talked a lot about these heavy industries, but what about other applications? Like, are there any other areas where hydrogen is making a difference?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're seeing hydrogen being used in all sorts of things, like powering trains and ships, generating electricity for homes and businesses. Even the potential for hydrogen to revolutionize aviation is huge.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, imagine a world where we could fly across continents without emitting any carbon.
That would be incredible.
It's a really exciting prospect.
Yeah, for sure. But, with all these incredible possibilities, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are still some challenges ahead before hydrogen becomes mainstream, right?
Oh, absolutely. We've made incredible progress, but we still have to be realistic about the hurdles
Yeah.
that remain.
So, what are some of those obstacles that are standing in the way of widespread hydrogen adoption?
Well, one of the biggest is cost.
Okay.
Green hydrogen is becoming more competitive, but it's still more expensive than gray hydrogen,
Right.
which is produced from fossil fuels. So closing that cost gap is going to be a major challenge.
So what are some of the other obstacles that we need to be thinking about?
Another big challenge is the need for a robust hydrogen infrastructure.
Hmm.
We need more production facilities, pipelines, storage tanks, refueling stations,
Right.
just to make hydrogen readily available and accessible to everyone.
So it's a huge undertaking.
It is, yeah.
And I imagine there are also some safety concerns, right?
Mhm.
I mean, hydrogen's flammable, so we need to make sure it's handled responsibly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Safety is paramount. We need to make sure that hydrogen is handled and transported safely and responsibly.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, but it seems like there's a lot of momentum building behind hydrogen energy.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm curious to hear more about what the future holds. Like, what are some of the things we can expect to see in the coming years?
Well, I think the future of hydrogen is incredibly bright. We're seeing unprecedented levels of investment and innovation, and governments around the world are starting to put policies in place to support the growth of the hydrogen economy.
Yeah, that's exciting.
So I think the next few years will be really crucial as we scale up production, build out the infrastructure, and continue to drive down those costs.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how it all unfolds. And I think maybe a good place to pick up in part 2 of this deep dive would be to explore some of those specific applications of hydrogen in more detail. What do you think?
I think that sounds like a great plan.
All right, we'll be back in a bit. All right, so we're back. And I'm really excited to dive deeper into some of those specific applications of hydrogen that we were talking about before the break.
Yeah, me too.
You mentioned that one of the really promising areas is the use of hydrogen in industries like steel production,
Right.
which traditionally has been a huge source of those carbon emissions, right?
Yeah, exactly. Steel production is a really energy-intensive process. And it's relied heavily on coal for a long time, but the good news is we're now seeing companies starting to use green hydrogen to replace that coal.
Oh, wow. So instead of all those, smokestacks and all that pollution, we could have steel mills that are running on clean hydrogen.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's pretty amazing. So can you walk us through how that works? Like, how do you actually use hydrogen to make steel?
Yeah, so traditional steel making, you use coal to heat up iron ore
Mm-hmm.
and to remove oxygen. And in that process, you release a lot of carbon dioxide.
Right.
But with hydrogen, it's a different process. You can use hydrogen as what's called a reducing agent,
Okay.
and it reacts with the iron oxide to produce iron and water vapor as the byproduct.
Wow.
So it's a much cleaner way to make steel.
So it's like swapping out a dirty old furnace for a sleek, new, hydrogen-powered one.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty significant shift.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, I imagine there were some challenges in actually making that transition, right?
Yeah, there are always challenges when you're trying to adopt new technologies on a large scale.
One of the key hurdles is the cost of green hydrogen. It's becoming more competitive, as we talked about,
Right.
but it's still more expensive than using those traditional coal-based methods.
Gotcha. So it sounds like, economics are going to play a big role in how quickly we see this technology take off.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So beyond steel, are there any other industries that are looking at hydrogen as a potential solution?
Yeah, another one that's really promising is the chemical industry. A lot of chemical processes currently rely on fossil fuels,
Okay.
but hydrogen can be used as a clean alternative feedstock for making all sorts of chemicals like ammonia, methanol, fertilizers.
Right.
So switching to hydrogen in these processes could dramatically reduce the carbon footprint of that whole sector.
It's amazing. It seems like hydrogen has the potential to touch so many different parts of our lives.
Yeah, it really does.
And I know we talked a little bit about hydrogen cars earlier.
Yes.
Where do they stand in all of this? Are we going to be seeing hydrogen cars on the roads anytime soon? Yeah, so hydrogen cars, or technically fuel cell electric vehicles,
Okay.
they definitely have some advantages over those battery electric vehicles. Things like longer ranges, faster refueling times, and of course, zero tailpipe emissions.
Yeah, those are big pluses.
But one of the main challenges is the lack of that refueling infrastructure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can't really drive a hydrogen car if there's nowhere to fill it up.
Exactly. And that's where government incentives and private investment are going to be so important
Right.
in actually driving the adoption of these vehicles.
So it sounds like it's kind of a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah, it is. People are hesitant to buy hydrogen cars without enough refueling stations.
Right.
And then companies don't want to invest in building those stations unless there's enough demand.
Yeah. So somebody's got to take that first step.
Exactly.
But it does seem like there's some momentum building, right? Like, are there any countries that are kind of leading the way in terms of hydrogen car adoption?
Yeah, we're starting to see that in countries like Japan and Germany, where there have been some pretty significant investments in that hydrogen refueling infrastructure.
Okay, so maybe there's hope that we'll actually see these hydrogen cars become a reality on our roads in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's definitely a possibility.
So, we've talked about cars, but what about other forms of transportation? I mean, I've heard people talking about hydrogen-powered planes, even ships.
Yeah, it's not just science fiction anymore.
Really?
Yeah, hydrogen-powered planes are still in those early stages of development, but there's a lot of excitement about their potential to really revolutionize aviation. The challenges are still significant,
Right.
mainly around the weight and storage of hydrogen. But there are some companies working on some pretty cool solutions.
Okay, like what?
So one of the things they're looking at is using liquid organic hydrogen carriers, or LOHCs.
LOHCs. That sounds pretty complicated.
It's actually not as bad as it sounds.
Okay.
You can think of it like a sponge that absorbs hydrogen and then releases it when you need it. So it's a safe and convenient way to store and transport hydrogen, which is especially important for something like aviation, where weight is a major factor.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's kind of like having a hydrogen gas station on wings.
Exactly.
So what about ships? Are we going to see cargo ships and cruise liners running on hydrogen anytime soon?
Yeah, I think so. Hydrogen is gaining traction in the maritime industry as well.
Okay.
There are already several pilot projects underway to test out hydrogen fuel cells on ferries and smaller vessels,
Hmm.
and larger cargo ships are being designed with hydrogen propulsion in mind.
So it seems like hydrogen is making waves in just about every mode of transportation.
Yeah, it really is. It's a versatile fuel source.
So, I mean, we've talked a lot about transportation.
Huh?
What about using hydrogen to power our homes and businesses? Is that a realistic possibility?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
You can use hydrogen to generate electricity through fuel cells, which are super efficient and produce zero emissions.
Okay.
So they're ideal for providing clean power to homes and businesses.
So, like, you could have solar panels on your roof generating electricity during the day, and then you could store that excess energy in a hydrogen fuel cell to use at night or when the sun's not shining.
Exactly. That's one of the really promising applications.
That's really cool. So it's like a clean energy backup system.
Yeah, exactly. And you can take that concept even further with the idea of microgrids.
Okay, wait. Explain microgrids to me.
Sure.
Like, I've heard the term, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
Yeah, so a microgrid is basically a small-scale electricity grid
Okay.
that can operate independently from the main grid. So it's like having your own mini power plant for your neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
And hydrogen can play a key role in these microgrids.
Uh-huh.
By acting as a buffer, it can store that excess energy generated from those renewable sources and release it when it's needed.
So it's like a hydrogen-powered safety net for your local energy grid.
Exactly.
I love it.
It creates a much more resilient and sustainable energy system, especially for communities that want to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And I think, it's easy to get caught up in all the amazing potential of hydrogen, but it's important to kind of stay grounded and acknowledge that there might be some downsides or challenges that we need to be aware of.
Right. You always want to be realistic and take a balanced perspective.
So what are some of those potential drawbacks or concerns that we should be thinking about?
Well, one thing to consider is the energy intensity of producing green hydrogen.
Okay.
Even though it uses renewable energy sources, it still takes quite a bit of electricity to split those water molecules and make that hydrogen. So we need to make sure that the electricity we're using is coming from truly clean sources to avoid just shifting emissions from one sector to another.
Yeah, that makes sense. We can't just pretend like green hydrogen magically appears without any environmental impact.
Exactly.
Are there any other concerns that we should be aware of?
Yeah, another concern is the potential for hydrogen leaks.
Okay.
Hydrogen is a very small molecule. It can leak from pipelines, storage tanks, all sorts of infrastructure. And while hydrogen itself isn't toxic, if it leaks into the atmosphere, it can act as an indirect greenhouse gas.
So safety and leak prevention are going to be really important.
Absolutely, especially as we scale up production and distribution.
So it's not just about the technology itself, it's about the entire ecosystem that supports it.
Exactly.
And I think ultimately it comes down to public perception and acceptance.
Right.
People need to feel comfortable and safe using hydrogen energy,
Absolutely.
whether it's fueling their cars or having a hydrogen-powered heating system in their homes.
Right. Trust and understanding are essential.
So we need to demystify hydrogen, address any misconceptions,
Yeah.
and really highlight the benefits
Sure.
in a way that resonates with people.
Yeah, we need to paint a picture of a future where hydrogen is just a normal part of our lives, something that's safe and reliable.
And it's interesting. I think we are starting to see a shift in that narrative, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It's not this futuristic, far-off concept anymore.
Yeah, it's becoming much more real and tangible.
Yeah. It's becoming a solution.
A solution for today.
Yeah. And it's not just about the technology. It's about creating a better world.
Exactly. That's what it's all about in the end.
I think maybe it's time to shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about those bigger picture implications of hydrogen.
Sounds good.
Its role in the global energy landscape and some of the possibilities that lie ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to go next.
Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about the nitty-gritty of hydrogen, the tech, the applications, even some of the challenges.
Yeah.
But now I'm kind of curious about the bigger picture.
Okay.
Like, where does hydrogen fit in the global energy landscape?
Right.
What role can it play in creating a more sustainable future?
Well, it's a big question, right?
Yeah.
And I think policymakers and researchers are really grappling with that, but it's becoming clear that hydrogen has the potential to be a real game changer, especially when it comes to shifting to those cleaner energy sources. It's a versatile way to decarbonize those sectors that are really hard to electrify, like heavy industry
Yeah.
and that long-distance transportation.
So it's not just about replacing gasoline in our cars anymore, right? We're talking about like transforming entire industries.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe even like reshaping the whole global energy map.
That's the exciting part, right? And what's really interesting is that we're seeing this global race to develop and deploy these hydrogen technologies.
Oh, wow.
Countries like China, Japan, South Korea, the EU, they're all making huge investments.
It's like the new space race, but for clean energy this time.
It is.
So what's driving this competition? Like, why is everybody so focused on hydrogen?
Well, I think there's this growing realization that we absolutely have to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels if we want to tackle climate change. And hydrogen offers this clean alternative that can help countries meet those emissions reduction targets. But it's not just about the environment, it's also about economics. Those countries that are leading in hydrogen technology are going to have this big economic advantage.
Makes sense.
In this new green energy market that's emerging.
So it's kind of a win-win, right? Good for the planet, good for the economy.
Exactly. And with so many players in the game now, I think the next few years are going to be really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So how do you see the landscape evolving? I mean, will it be every country for itself, or is there room for collaboration?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot of innovation and collaboration, but there's going to be healthy competition too. You know, different countries have different strengths, and they're focusing on different parts of that hydrogen value chain. Like China, they're emerging as a leader in manufacturing those electrolyzers, while Japan, they're focused on fuel cells for vehicles and homes.
So it's like this global hydrogen puzzle where each country brings its own piece to the table.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
So what about the U.S.? Where do we fit in all of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, the U.S. has historically been a leader in hydrogen research, but it's lagged behind a little bit in terms of that large-scale deployment and policy support. But I think things are starting to change with recent legislation, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes some big incentives for clean hydrogen production.
So it seems like the U.S. is finally starting to catch up.
Yeah, I think so. Better late than never, right?
That's true. So with all this activity happening globally, what are some of the key trends or developments that you're really keeping an eye on?
Well, one interesting trend is this increasing focus on green hydrogen. You know, the kind produced using those renewable energy sources. Governments and companies are realizing that green hydrogen is really the most sustainable pathway, and they're shifting their investments accordingly. There's also a lot of innovation happening in hydrogen storage and transportation. You know, new technologies are emerging that make it easier and safer to move hydrogen around.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that earlier.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be key to scaling up the industry.
And what about international collaboration? You know, is it all about competition, or is there room for countries to work together on this?
Oh, I think collaboration is going to be crucial for accelerating the development and deployment of hydrogen technologies. You know, we're already seeing partnerships forming between countries to share knowledge, resources, best practices.
Oh, wow. So, like, what are some examples of that?
Well, there are some projects underway to develop these international hydrogen supply chains. You know, countries like Australia and Chile, they're looking to export that green hydrogen produced from all their abundant solar and wind resources.
So it's not just about competition, it's also about countries working together to leverage each other's strengths.
Yeah, exactly. That's how we're going to make real progress.
So, you know, at the end of the day, it all comes back to how hydrogen can actually benefit people's lives.
Right.
What does a hydrogen-powered future look like for everyday people?
Well, imagine a world where the air is cleaner because those trucks and buses are running on hydrogen. Imagine homes and businesses powered by renewable electricity with hydrogen as that backup. Imagine traveling the world on planes and ships that don't emit any harmful pollutants.
Wow.
That's the potential of a hydrogen-powered future.
Yeah, that's a future I think a lot of people would get behind.
Me too.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what advice would you give to our listeners who are intrigued by all this and want to learn more, maybe even get involved in this emerging field?
Well, I'd say stay informed, stay curious, and don't be afraid to jump in. You know, there are so many resources available online, in libraries, through community organizations, attend webinars, read articles, talk to people working in the sector.
It sounds like an exciting time to be part of this hydrogen revolution.
It really is, and everybody has a role to play.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for taking us on this incredible journey into the world of hydrogen energy.
My pleasure.
It's been a real eye-opener, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling just as energized and inspired as I am.
I hope so. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new and that you're as excited about the future of hydrogen as we are.